Today, in part 2, we're returning to the topic of hostages in Jewish history. Last time, we spent most of our attention on the exceptions to the rule. This time, we're looking at cases where the Mishnah's ban on overpaying played at least a partial role in shaping actual halachic decisions and communal policy. And yet, as we will see, the overarching conclusion that we reached in the prior class will hold. Overpaying often occurred. And it's all a step closer to discussing this dilemma in the contemporary context, which we will do be'ezras Hashem in the next class. Okay, in the previous year, if I had to sum up the last class, the first class on the subject of hostages in Jewish history, the dilemma of hostages, I think a fair summary would be that we saw throughout Jewish history, and we focused on two centuries, where there were many different avenues that Chachamim used to justify overpaying in order to release a hostage. I think by the final count, we had some 9 different justifications that were used during the period of the 1400s and the 1500s. Okay, so in other words, last class was very much about the exception to the rule. Today, I want to dig deeper into the rule itself. And that is, we know the din, we learned the din already last week, but I want to see where do we find this halacha being invoked in a positive way, in a way that we're actually going to keep it as an argument for behavior in a real case in halacha. That's what we're going to do today. And our first stop is going to be a quote from the Marshal, the Yamshel Shloima, about Maharam and Rothenburg. So Maharam and Rothenburg is the mayor of Rothenburg, and he passed away in 1293. And Marshal, in his quote on Maseches Gittin, says as follows: Shamati al Maharam and Rothenburg. I heard about Maharam and Rothenburg, Zechreina Levracha. Shahaya Tafuz b'Migdol Aigezham Kama Shonim. He was captured, he was in captivity in a Migdal. A Migdal is a castle. The name of this place seems to be Inzilsheim, which is a place in eastern France today. And there was a castle there during the Middle Ages. And Maharam Rothenburg was held there. V'hasar, and the king, we'll learn more about him soon, Tava min ha'kehila Isach Gadol, demanded a lot from the Jewish communities to free this great sage. And they wanted to get him out. But Maharam didn't allow it. Ki Amar, Maharam said, he quoted the din, the amount was an exorbitant sum. Maharam invoked the din that you're not allowed to pay an exorbitant sum, and therefore he didn't allow for his release. Now, what's really interesting about this passage is Marshal, writing in the 1500s, was one of the rabbis we looked at last week who was a big makil in this area. He was one of those who offered justifications for why it's okay to pay exorbitant prices. So that's his own opinion. And here he seems to have a Kabbalah, a Mesorah, from prior generations. He uses the Lashon Shamati, I heard, that Maharam and Rothenburg was incarcerated and that he didn't allow himself to be released, invoking this din. So apparently this would be a case, a real case in history, in where this din was used to guide behavior. In this case, Maharam paskening for himself not to be released from prison. We know more about this case from elsewhere. Here the Marshal only gives us a few lines. But in the Sefer Minhagos Vermaisa, which was written by someone who lived in the 1600s, his name was Rabbi Yehuda Kirchheim. So in this Sefer, he writes as follows. He writes, Kol Zeh, he's describing over here an event that happened during the First Crusade in the year 1096. And he says, after the event, Kol Zeh Matzasi bin Yar Echad, I found all of it. How do I know this information? I found it in a piece of paper, Yashan, it's old, Umatushtash, worn out. When did I find it? Bishna Shin Ayin Vav, in the year 1616. Bisha shemifne ha'ofar va'avanim min abeis hakneses poi shecharvu harmordim. When we were cleaning away the rubble from the shul that was destroyed by the rebels. In 1615, the Jews of Worms were expelled locally by city officials. That was a rebellion of sorts against the emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor was against this expulsion. They were readmitted the next year in 1616, and apparently they were going through the destroyed shul, and they found an old document. And this document had the story about the Crusaders, which is not relevant for our purposes. But then he continues and he says, Reb Yehuda says, V'oid matzasi b'ksav hazeh, I also found b'zeh alosh in the following quote, Moireinu arav remeir merottenburg, sam lederech pa'amav la'aver hayam. The great Rameir of Rottenburg, he set out to travel, to cross by sea. Presumably he was going to go to Eretz Yisrael. Where else would he have been going by sea at that time? V'hinei pisa im ba ashoydet ha'hegmoin harosha yamach shemai v'zichroi mi Basel. So the Hegmoin, that's the bishop from Basel, passed the place where Maram Rottenburg was staying. We know the name of the bishop of Basel. His name was von Reichenstein. Anyway, the Imai with this bishop is a Mishumad Echad, and the Mishumad, this Jew who converted, his name is Kimpa. Yamach Shemai v'Zichroi. This Kimpa recognized Maram Rottenburg because he grew up as a Yid, and so he knew what Maram looked like. And so he told the bishop. The bishop caused that a local count, Meinhard of Gvilin, who was the Tsar of that city, he arrested Maram Rottenburg on Dalet Tammuz in the year Mem Vav, which is the year 1286. Umisaruhu, and then this count, or duke, whoever he was, handed him over to the Holy Roman Emperor, who was Rudolph at the time. So what's the issue over here? The issue here is if Maram, the great Gadol Ador, leaves, so then maybe other Jews are going to leave, and that's a loss for taxes, an important point, source of revenue for someone like Rudolph and others would have been the Jewish presence. And so they're not thrilled about him leaving. And again, what the legal justification is arresting him, that I'm not clear on. But that would have been the primary motive of what of why he would have been arrested. And the account goes on to say that he passed away in Tfisa Yud Tes Iyar Shnas Nun Gimel in 1293. So it's about 7 years that he is held in prison. Remember, Marshal said that he was Tafus in Migdal in Zinheim. I should point out that Agoyes Maimonides, when you learn the Rambam, he comments about, his name was Reb Meir. He was a Talmud of Maram Rottenburg. And once in a while he writes, I heard from my teacher in Migdal in Zinheim. So in other words, students at points had access to him, they were able to learn from him, they were able to hear from him. Okay, so he passed away in 1293. The account from this, again, loose paper in Worms. That's the year 1303. And this account says it was Dalet Iyar. The only problem with that is that we have Maram's gravestone, and the gravestone says it was Dalet Adar. Iyar and Adar, you could see how in a manuscript that could get messed up. Okay, and then at that point, in other words, so what happened? Why was there a delay from 1293 until 1303 when he was finally buried? Because that's when Ara Ruach Nediva Belev Nedivecha. That's when a particular Nediv was moved and he to do something about it. He lived in Kilas Kodesh, Frankfurt. Notice the Vav. We spoke about that last week in the German accent, switching a Fei to a Vav. Okay, V'hayashav HaNediv Zuskin Vitik, and this Nediv, his name was Zuskin Vitik, and Upizer Hoin Atik. He spent a ton of money, a boatload of money, in order to redeem the body of Maram at Rottenburg, Ad Shevi L'Kvuran. That's what enabled him to be buried in the Kehila Kedosha of Vermeiza in Worms. V'oisen Nediv Niftar Acharav, and then this wealthy Jew, Zuskind, he passed away after the Kana Shvisasa Yatzla, and he's buried right next to Maram me Rottenburg. So what do you have in this part? So what's interesting, this gives us, on the one hand, it gives us more information about about what Marshal told us about. But on the other hand, it also rounds out the picture in the other way. Marshal said Maram didn't want to be released. And what did they end up doing? They ended up paying a hoin atik in order to release him. So while on the one hand, this is very much what we're talking about this week, when the law is invoked, l'chomra, so to speak, and we saw that from the Marshal, but at the same time, this very story also shows you what I was talking about last week, where the law is, if you want to use the word ignored or circumvented, or a heter is developed and that you're also seeing over here in terms of the redemption of his body. Now, what happens is Hemshech Maisa. We have in Seder Adoros. Seder Adoros is written by Rabbi Yechiel Halperin. He lived in the 1700s. He was the Rav of Minsk, and he wrote this work of history called Seder Adoros. And he reports something that he heard. Shamaiti, I heard from a Talmud Chacham who heard from a Gidei Emes, that the night after Maharam was buried, the Maharam came in a dream to this Zuskind. And he told him, you could choose one of two things. Either you can have, you and your descendants forever have Oisher and Kavod, or you can die immediately but get a guaranteed share in Olam Haba. Maybe it means a great portion in Olam Haba. And the story tells us that he chose the latter, and that's what happened. Okay, the problem with that is, we know he didn't, his gravestone, we have his gravestone, and it says he died in 1308, which is 4.5 years after the Maharam would have been buried. But okay, this is the way this story was remembered, at least in the times of Rabbi Yechiel Halperin in the 1700s, here as well. Not only is it mutter, but like Maharam agreed with it, like Maharam came in a dream, and Maharam gave haskama. So that's why I'm coming back to this idea of, on the one hand, you have invoking this din l'chumrah, but at the same time, you see, perhaps with a valid reason. All of the heterim that we saw last week, I'd argue, have valid reasons. And we're seeing that over here play out as well. Now, when we're speaking about Maharam Rottenberg, it's worth saying, what about his writings on this subject? Do we have anything from him in writing that would lend itself to a strict ruling on the question of Ein Poidin? And the answer is that there's something that gets pretty close to it. So let's have a look. This is the closest that I think we can get. So this comes from another one of his students. Before I mentioned Meir, the Agois Maimonides, this comes from Mordechai ben Hillel. He also was a Talmud of Maharam Rottenberg, and his work is printed in the back of the Gemara. And he tells us in Maseches Baba Metzia, in the 7th chapter, he says as follows: Pasak Rabbeinu Meir. There was a psak of Rabbeinu Meir, Alaov Sheshalach Zbnei B'Shlichus. Once upon a time there was a father, and the father sent his son on a mission, and the child was captured, and the child has no money to get himself out, to redeem himself. So it sounds like it was a real case. And Maharam ruled that the father is obligated to pay to get the son out. And he's not allowed to turn this into a communal expense. The lav kolemenu sheyashir es atzmai. You can't make yourself wealthy, because let's say he was doing some business deal over here. V'yapos b'nai letzibor, and make the community pay. That's not fair. You got to get your son out, even if you don't support your son. Ein samoch al shulchanai. So it's not a din in the fact that he's your son, even if the son lives separately and whatever. You don't that. Isn't supported by his father. It doesn't change the din. Why? So here's the reason. Because you sent him. It's a din in shlichus. If a mishaleach sent a shliach, and then something tragic like this happens to the shliach, who's responsible? The mishaleach, the one who sent him. It's as if his body was being lent to the father, and so therefore the father has to pay to get him out and can't turn it into a communal expense. Okay, really, you could get into a whole subject over here. This is something that's come up in the past. We've discussed this, and it comes up here as well. If A sends B on a shlichus, and then something happens to B, to what degree is A responsible? If you remember in the class that we did on conscription, on the kantanistin, this issue came up, and there are tshuvas about it. So this is a relevant source, but I don't want to talk about that. What I want to talk about is the fact that he says, how much does a father need to pay to get him out? He says, bichdei damav, and he continues and says, avol yeser bichdei damav loy. If, however, the cost is more than the amount that the child is worth on the markets, as we spoke about last week, what that means, then the father has no obligation. And he quotes the Mishnah that we're not supposed to redeem them more than their amount, more than their value. I have no reason to try to interpret this other than on face value. Face value, you're not supposed to. If he quote, that's what it means in the Mishnah. And so therefore on face value, if the Mordechai is quoting this, I think he also means you're not supposed to. If you want to kvetch, you could say it just means he's not a chiyuv. If you want, you could say that. It's not a chiyuv on the father. But if the father wants, maybe you could kvetch that way in the paragraph, but I see no reason to do that. So maybe you could say that here, at the very least, this is what you can say. Here we have a case of Maran Rottenberg invoked this din, and it was halacha l'maisa. Halacha l'maisa in the sense that it was a real case that happened, and he said, but you need to pay a certain amount, but more than that amount, you don't need to pay. So at the very least, it was invoked halacha l'maisa, and maybe even he meant and there's no heter, and there's no workaround, and this is a very strict rule, which would be consistent with what Marshall is telling us about what his attitude was about his own incarceration. Okay, so that's scene number one in terms of our overall objective today, which is again to see where this din is being invoked l'chumra. Now, what I want to do is as follows. I want to look at 3 cases of kehilos that made takanis, and you're very, very clearly able to notice that the takanis these kehilos are making are very much in line with the din l'chumra in the Mishnah, or very much consistent with the concern that the Mishnah has. So let's have a look. So first up comes from Shal Shuvas Rebbe Zriel ben Reb Shloima Dayina. Okay, not a very well-known figure. He lived in the late 1400s, early 1500s in Sabioneta in Italy. He passed away in 1536. And he has a tshuva, recently published his tshuvas, and he writes as follows. Nafshi lev yoinim, I feel really bad for the poor people, asher higlu mitunis, who were exiled from Tunis, v'nimkru l'shavoim, and they were sold to captors, to pirates. So when was this? So apparently Tunis was captured twice, in 1534 and 1535. In 1534, the Ottomans came and took Tunis. And then in 1535, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V came and took Tunis from the Muslims. So in one of these 2 events, either when the Ottomans took it, probably then, or when Charles took it, less likely then, there were Jews who ended up being captured and they were sold off. And he goes on to say, we need to do something about it, we can't stand by, everyone agrees, we need to do something. He says, we have to do this smart. Why? We learned of Mesechus Gittin. It says, and you're not allowed to overpay. And the reason is, the Gemara has a doubt. What is the tikkun olam? Is it because of the current financial strain on the community if they're overpaying? Or perhaps, we don't want to incentivize that they're going to take people in the future. So he says, either way, both of them are very real concerns now in our time. If we're going to overpay to get these guys out of this captivity, it's going to cause both of these problems. Then he, very interestingly, adds a third reason why he doesn't like overpaying. Look at this. We have the problem of the liars, the people who present, they fake as if they're captives, or as they're representing captives. So in other words, someone would come over to a community and say, my brother, or someone I know, or maybe me, once I was captured and it was this huge amount of money, and I got myself out by borrowing, but now I need to pay back. Or so that's if the person was talking for himself. Or my brother is captured, and people would use this, and it made sense in people's head. Yeah, you need to pay a lot of money. That's what the market is. We pay a lot of money. And so what happens is it incentivizes people to then lie, and if they're going to schnar in a lying way, they're going to use this as an excuse. Okay, I mean, so he throws that in as a third reason why it's a good idea not to overpay. We're going to knock out this incentive for lying. It's a good idea. Lasum seder v'kitzot, to do this in an organized way. Liftois ish bekach, a man should be a certain amount. Isha bekach, a woman a certain amount. Na'arim bekach, children a certain amount. V'lo yavar, and we shouldn't violate this. Then he goes on to say that every single community in Italy should collect money. Mikol bale chanuyos. Chanuyos, this is referring to the people who would lend money on interest. He gives a rate of how much per your income, how much you should be paying to this fund. And so he's organized on both ends, both on how he's going to raise the money, also how the money is going to be paid out. That then it's going to work out very good. Then we won't be straining the financial resources of our community. Then we won't incentivize the captors to come and take Jews. And they'll stop once and for all and chase him after the necks of these unfortunate Jews. Whoa, what do you have here? He quotes the Mishnah, and he's trying to implement the vision of the Mishnah. Here you have someone who's taking this this Mishnah, and he's taking it very seriously. And he's trying to say, let's implement this in Italy in the 1530s. So that's something that we're trying to do here. We're trying to see instances where this plays out. Now, what would he say if, let's say, there was a case of a Jew who's in captivity and they tried this scheme and the guy's like, sorry, we're not letting him out. What would he say? Would he say, usser? Would he say, oh, so I'm not ready to say he would go that far. I'm not ready to say he'll go. So in other words, I don't want to take this as if, oh, so he's an extreme machmir in this din. No, I'm not. You don't see that. What you see is someone who sees this Mishnah and says, let's implement this now in the 1530s, which also tells you, by the way, stuff that we saw last week. He obviously wouldn't need to say this or do this if this was the norm in the Jewish world. So this wasn't the norm in the Jewish world, which affirms what we were showing last week. And he's saying, let's try to live up to this Mishnah. Okay, that's example number 1. Example number 2 comes from the famous events that happened in Ukraine in 1648, 1649. This is the Cossack rebellion, the massacres of Tach v'Tat. And what happens is that one of the areas that this impacts is Lithuania. Now, Lithuania as follows. Lithuania, there was this moised, there was this organization, Jewish Life in Poland was autonomous. And the governing body for this Jewish life in Poland was known as the Vad Arba Aratzos. At least that was a typical name. And this Vad Arba Aratzos represented Polish Jewry. Their main job was, how much taxes does the Polish government demand of us this year? Okay, how are we going to pay it? Who's paying what? That was the main job of Vad Arba Aratzos. But they also did other things. They controlled a lot of Jewish life in Poland. Now what happened was, Lithuania was one of the Aratzos, one of the provinces. And they had a seat at the table or at this Vad. However, in the year 1623, Lithuania broke away, the Jewish community that is, and said, we don't see a reason for us to be part of the regular Vad Arba Aratzos. We're going to do our own thing, which meant they negotiated separately with the Polish. They were still under the Polish crown. So they negotiated separately with the Polish crown about their taxes, and they operated independently. And their 3 central communities, and these were the bosses, were Brisk, Horodna, and Pinsk. And these 3 cities basically controlled, these were the largest ones, and they would control what went on policy for Jewry in Lithuania. Now they had a pinkas. Communities but usually a community would have a pinkas, and the Vad Arba Aratzos also had a pinkas. The problem with the Vad Arba Aratzos pinkas is it's been lost. So we have snippets of it. People have tried to recreate what parts of it would have looked like, but the actual ledger that this community had, which would be an amazing oitzer if we had it, doesn't exist for Poland. But for Lithuania, it does. In 1925, a man by the name of Shimon Dobinov published this pinkas. And so here we read the following resolution that was reached for the Vad of Tough Test. That's the year 1649. Reads as follows. I see how many Jews were captured, and they're being assimilated among the non-Jews. They're being taken by the non-Jews. So this is referring to, during this time, there were specifically the Tartars, were those who were targeting Yidden, and instead of killing them, they would actually take them and sell them for a profit. And so they say the expenses are on Klal HaMedina. That means it's our budget concern to pay for the release of these hostages. However, they say we're worried that if you're going to let the Rashi Kehilas know, and you're going to wait for authorization to spend money, right? Red tape. So Shoy Veres, the situation's going to pass. And we're afraid you may be in a situation where you could get a Jew out, be like, I need authorization to spend this money because it needs to come from Central. So you're going to wait till you get money from Central, so then, what could happen. So therefore, we're writing to all the Kehilas. They're writing in the ledger what they already wrote. We already sent out letters to all the Kehilas and all the Mekoimis that have just a minion of Jews. There were areas that had very, very few Jews, small pockets of Jews. It says, you have permission to redeem any Jew ad Yud Zehuvim. For 10 coins, gold coins, and you don't have to answer the shus, and then we'll pay you back. If it's more than 10 coins, if it's from 10 to 60, so then you can't just act randomly. You need to go to the Ke'ilah Smucha that has an Av Bezdin. So in other words, 10 Jews, they're not going to have Av Bezdin. But if you're big enough, they have Av Bezdin, go ask him. And if he's okay with the deal, then we'll reimburse you. then he says, but if it's more than 60 coins, so then no. Then you have to go to one of the 3 Rosh Kehilas. Then basically you need written authorization from Brisk, from Haradna, from Pinsk, from one of these people, and then we'll pay back whatever they made up you're able to do. And then they say, Kol Anal Nasa Bevada Medina. This is what we did when we convened on Friday, Beis Shvat, in the year Tov Tes Leprat, 1649. And they tell you where they are in the Kehila Kedosha of Mistetsky. That was where they convened on that day. What do you see here? You see they are trying to live up to the spirit of the Mishnah. They don't want to overpay, on the one hand. And so therefore they're like, well, you need to put a system in place. But at the same time, it's also very, very clear that they're happy to have a 3-way hierarchy. And it's like, it's very clear from this that in certain situations, they'd be open to pay a lot of money, which is more consistent with what we saw last week. But still, you still see over here a spirit, the desire to implement at least somewhat the spirit of this Mishnah. And the third example will bring us back to Italy, to Livorno, and this comes from an Eidos in the late 1700s. The writer over here is a sefer's named Chikrei Lev, and the author lived in Izmir in the Ottoman Empire. His name was Rafal Yosef Chazan. And he has a case over here. The case is an interesting question, but we're not going to care so much about the question. What we're going to be interested in is the eidos on the convention of how Livorno dealt with captives. So what is the case? He says as follows. I'm in Izmir, and 2 brothers-in-law came for a din Torah by me. One, his name is Shemtov Halevi, and the other one is Harav, either Shmuel, Shloima, or something like that. I don't know. I'm going to go with Shloima, just for, I want him to have a name. So we have Shemtov Halevi and we have Shloima Kalamuti. And what's the case? The case is that Shloima Kalamuti went to Eretz Yisrael. He went to visit. He was going to come back. And when he was gone, he appointed his brother-in-law to be his representative for his entire estate. When he was returning from Eretz Yisrael to come back here, to come back to Izmir, he was captured along with 4 other Jews. Who captured him? The Maltese. So Malta is an island south of Italy, and during this period in time, in the 1500s and the 1600s, even in the 1700s, it was run by knights, and one of the ikr things that they were busy doing for supporting their economy was piracy. And so they're very famous, the Maltan Knights and their piracy, and so they captured this Reb Shloima Kalamuti. Okay. Now what happens is, somehow the case lands in Livorno. So in the Italian city of Livorno, they have a takana, that they're giving for every shavui a certain amount, a davar katsuv. If the guy wants it, meaning the captor, if he doesn't want it, they say, you keep your captive. We're not redeeming you. He could do it on his own, but we as a kehillah, we're not intervening. We have a flat rate. You want to play ball with us, good. Otherwise, the captive has to figure it out on himself. Okay. Now what happened was, the 5 Jews that were captured, they were not wealthy. Only 2 of them were wealthy. Reb Shloima Kalamuti, he was wealthy, and someone else whose name was Yosef Yisrael. So the guy who captured them was not willing to take the amount Livorno was offering. And so what happened was that the brother Shemtov, who's the brother-in-law, who is in charge of Reb Shloima's estate, and also a brother-in-law for Yosef Yisrael, they wrote to Livorno that said, please make your best offer. If the captors aren't going to be willing to take it, so then pay whatever they want, and we'll pay you back. That's what basically the relatives of these 2 wealthy people wrote to Livorno. Okay, now Livorno is not going to act until they have the money. They're not going to do that. They're not going to lay out the money. They're not going to see it. So in other words, for this deal to work, you have to basically send a check, and it needs to clear. Then Livorno will go over to the guy and say, by the way, you're accepting $10. That's what we're willing to give you. He says, no. Oh, okay, so you're not accepting 10, but the family, that's our money. But the family, we already got the money. Okay, so you need to send the money to get this deal going. However, Shemtov, remember, is the brother-in-law of Shloima Kalamuti. He didn't send the money. Why? Because he was afraid of Shloima Kalamuti. He was afraid that Shloima Kalamuti was going to say, why do you send the money? No, don't do it. I'd rather sit in prison another few weeks until they break. Why should we break? So he was afraid that Shloima Kalamuti is not going to want it. So therefore the brother-in-law is like, I'm the guardian of his estate. I need to handle his money wisely. So he didn't want to do it, even though he did right. It sounds like he was interested, but he got cold feet. But then Shlomo's mother and Shlomo's wife came and said, come on, you got to do it. You got to send the money to Lavarna. So he did. They sent the money to Lavarna. They got these out. All the Jews were freed. It looks like the two wealthy guys and the remaining captives, and everyone lived happily ever after. Except that not everyone lived happily ever after, because when they came to Izmir, what happened was Yosef Yisrael, who was one of the wealthy guys, he paid his brother-in-law who sent money. He paid him back right away. Thank you very much for getting me out. You laid out this amount of money to get me out. I'll pay you back. However, Shlomo Kalamuti tells his brother-in-law Shem Tov, I'm not paying you. I don't want to pay you. Why? You see, his brother, they knew each other, right? They're family members. They knew each other. He knew this was going to happen, which is amazing. And he said, why? Because I don't want you to pay the money. Let's sit. We'll play a harder negotiation. He's like, yeah, but your mother and your wife said, I don't care about my mother and wife. Leave me in prison. Okay, so what's the psak din? So the psak din is, Rebbe Rafal Yitzchak Chazan says, I paskin that he has to pay it. Now, what sugya does this get us into? So it gets us into the sugya, if Ruvain does something to save Shimon. If Ruvain does, and Ruvain lays out money, does Shimon have to pay him back? And really, this came up already last week. In the first case last week, that was happening. I don't remember the names right now, but one of the people said, hey, why did you get my wife and granddaughter out? I didn't want the benefit from you, right? So that's the sugya. And the truth is, it's a sugya, there are tshuvas, there's halachas about it, it's complicated. I'm not so interested in that. I am telling you that he paskined over here that the nitzoil, the person who is benefited if they have money, does have to pay back. But the main thing I want you to see over here is this a third example. Here you see the Kehila Lavarno in the late 1700s basically saying we have a policy. So on the one hand, their policy reflects the value in the Mishnah. But on the other hand, it's also very clear that they pay over, that they overpay. Right? So that same tension that we keep on seeing is playing out. So as much as I said, in today's shir, we're going to see how the din is getting invoked, and it is getting invoked. In all these pieces, the din is getting invoked l'chumrah, but at the same time, we're still seeing the same pattern that we saw last week. And now we come to the question. The question is there a case? Can we find a case where there's a person, and we know their name? There's a person, and we know their name, and there's overcharging going on, and the Rav says, no, we're not going to pay. And you're not allowed to pay. We didn't see that yet. Even with Maram and Rottenberg in the beginning, there's no evidence that that was the case, that the case was that they were demanding more money. So again, do we have a case where there's someone with a name, someone that we know, who's incarcerated, they're demanding a lot of money, and the Rav invokes the Mishnah to say, no, the guy needs to stay in prison, and it's us to do anything less. So I said last time, I didn't find such a thing. Here, I'll present something that's close, but I still think it's not. I don't think it reaches that category, but it gets us a little close. Very tragic case, very troubling case, very difficult case, very interesting case as well. Okay, so let's go. This is a tshuva that comes from the author of the Nachlas Yaakov. The Nachlas Yaakov, his name was Yaakov, and he lived in the early 1600s in Poland, in Galicia, and he's famous for his commentary, Nachlas Yaakov, which is a commentary on Rashi. So if you want to learn Rashi, Ala Torah, like there's a Sifsei Chachamim, there's Mizrahi, one of the famous commentaries is a Nachlas Yaakov. We don't have tshuvas from him, but there is a Ksav Yad in the Bodleian Library in Oxford of one tshuva that is from him, that was published in the 1980s. Let's read the case. Ma'aseh Ira bim Koimenu, we had a story in our area, somewhere in Galicia, presumably, where there was someone, and later it becomes clear this guy's name was Shlomo ben Kloinemis. So Shlomo, the son of Kloimenis, Nishbeis Ishtoi Beyad HaKadorim, the Tartars came, they took his wife, and she's gone for 6 years already. Now you'll see later, the year is 1630 on this case, so it's before the Chmielnicki problems. Okay. V'halach achareh, the man went to get his wife back. Didn't work. V'gam shalach kama pamin liftais. He also sent other people to get her back. V'loi also beyada. He couldn't do it. Why? Because this captor is asking for more than double than all the other captives that are there. And all the other ones, remember, it's not like it was cheap. It was probably expensive, a regular Jewish captive at the time. But this guy is asking more than double. So something's already odd when someone is asking of and there's no evidence that this guy is wealthy. At least the tshuva does not mention it whatsoever. So something is odd. Why would he be asking for more than double? So the reason is because he likes her. He wants to marry her. In fact, he already lives with her as if they're husband and wife. He's not married. He doesn't have another wife. In fact, this Yiddish maidel already gave birth and is pregnant from this man, this Tartar. So the story continues that this Shlomo ben Klonimus, he hires another Jew whose name is Yaakov to go and look and go figure out if he could get her back still. Chazar Acharei went to look for her. He found her living in her home. Going here and there as a regular free person. No one was guarding her. So he was a little surprised. Like, I thought you're a captive, but you seem to be pretty comfortable over here. He started speaking to her. I came to redeem you. I can't leave, because I can't leave my child. One child has already been born. And the second, I'm pregnant with the second one. And maybe even by law, presumably by law, this non-Jew would have complete rights over these children. And I don't want to leave, so I can't leave because of that. So then the shliach goes to the non-Jew, and he says, "No, can we have her back?" You guys sent messengers already long ago. I already made a deal. I already told them what my demands are. It needs to be 800 coins, and a chagura shel kesef shetia shava mea adumim, and a silver belt, that's another 100 coins. The koiva sable, a fur hat, and a puter shel sable, and a fur coat. If I don't get this, you're not going to get her. That is what he told her. This witness, this hired man, Yaakov ben Yosef, who went after her, said that generally speaking, the impression she got from her was negative. In what sense? She kind of implied that she doesn't want to be redeemed. A very, very tragic story. The Gam she also says, you could understand that she would feel uncomfortable. She would be embarrassed to return. Okay. Now, the reason why this Yaakov ben Yosef was hired again after 6 years to go look into this again and to try to see if there's a deal that could be had over here is because the Shlomo ben Klonimus he can't handle this anymore. And Shlomo ben Klonimus wants to marry another woman. In order to marry another woman, essentially, we know Rabbeinu Gershom made a takana that a man is not allowed to marry two wives. However, there are circumstances when Rabbanim would do what's called a heter mea Rabbanim, a very, very special and unique thing of a special heter to allow a man to marry a second wife. The details of how that operates is beyond the scope of today's class, but that's essentially what he was looking for because she's gone for 6 years already. And what happened was the Rabbanim said, no. Past is past, you need to do another investigation, and that's why he hired Yaakov ben Yosef, but this was the report he came back with, which is not a positive report on multiple ends. Number one, it doesn't look like this guy is intent on releasing him. The testimony goes further to say that as much as he's making financial demands, he's not really serious. They don't even think he's serious about these financial demands. He just wants to hold on to her as a wife. And also the woman isn't really interested in coming back. So is he allowed to marry someone else? He wants to know what's going to be with him. Because he doesn't have children. He's not married. He doesn't have any children. So here is the tshuva of Reb Yaakov, the author of Nachlas Yaakov. He writes, Shezeho ish Shlomo ben Klonimus muter lisa isha acheres. He gives permission to Reb Shlomo to marry another woman. Why? His two main reasons are as follows. Number one, based on the evidence he has gotten, he does not believe that this guy is ever going to release her. Number one. Number two, he gets into another issue, and that is, did we reach a point where she in captivity is now with this man willingly? If in captivity, she's with this man willingly, so then she is asura labaila. Right? If a woman is captured, no matter what happens if it's against her will, so assuming the husband is not a kohen, she's muteres labaila. When she comes back, she's permitted. If, however, she willingly associated with the captor, so then she's asura labaila. Based on the evidence that he was getting, it sounded like this is someone who basically made peace with where she is, and so therefore she's asura labaila. So in other words, she's off limits to him in two ways. Number one, the guy is never going to release her. Number two, even if he did release her, she's asura labaila. So under those circumstances, he felt it's appropriate to give a heter me'er rabbanim and to allow him to go ahead and marry another woman. And now we come to them. Now, obviously, you can discuss this at great length, which we're not going to do. I want to talk about the issue that's relevant for us today, which is where we're going to pick up the tshuva. The ein loimar, don't say the nehida asura. Maybe you could say, okay, true. If she gets out, she's asur to him. But still, mikol loy greya me'ishes kohen. If this were a ishes kohen, so even if it's coercive, nonetheless, the woman is the ishes kohen cannot return. The woman cannot return to the wife, to the kohen. Now, does the kohen have to get her out? Of course, the kohen has to get her out. In other words, just because you can't continue being married to her doesn't mean that you're off the hook, and maybe you still have an obligation to get her to pay to get her back. And so now he's addressing essentially this question, and that is, even if you want to say that they can't be married to each other anymore, but does this man have a chiyuv in this case to continue trying to financially get his wife back? So he says no. Why? Number one, she doesn't want, she's meichel. Yes, a man has that obligation, but she's saying she's not interested, so she's meichel. Number two, it's impossible, because he already established that the guy is never going to release her. So again, that Torah doesn't ask of you to do something that's impossible. Or another way of saying it is, the chiyuv and the ksuba isn't to do something that's impossible. But then he comes to the main point. Another reason why he does not need to pay to get her out, because he's demanding more than her value. Now he says, now he continues, because it's not so pashut. Because as much as the din is a very pashut din, there's one thing that we didn't discuss last week and that we need to discuss now. And that is there an exception for a wife? So the Maisa is as follows. The Mishnah in Gittin we learned says, Ein poidin, period. No exceptions. However, there's a Braisa Meseches Ksubis. The Braisa Meseches Ksubis has a machloikas. Tana Kama says you need to pay more than the market value for a wife. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says, no, same rule applies. You don't overpay. Okay, so now the shaila is, who's the halacha like? Is it like the Tana Kama, that a wife is an exception? Or is halacha Reb Shimon ben Gamliel that is no exception? So this comes to Machlokes Rishonim. The Rif and the Rambam, they hold that you paskin like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Why? Because you have a Stam Mishnah in Gittin. The Stam Mishnah in Gittin says, Ein poidin. There's no exceptions over there. And so that's evidence, excuse me, to the Shitta of Shimon ben Gamliel, no exception. However, the Rush brings a Shitta that says that we paskin like the Tana Kama, in which case, as much as there's a rule that we don't overpay, there's an exception for a spouse. So now here we're dealing with a spouse. He just invoked the rule that you don't overpay, and that's a reason why he doesn't have to intervene over here. He doesn't have to pay. His third reason is why? His first reason why she doesn't want. Second reason is impossible. His third is because it's more than the value. More than the value. But 1 second, what about the fact that maybe for a wife you pay more than the value? He says, no. Even according to those who say the rule doesn't apply, and you could overpay for a wife, nonetheless, that's only you could. That doesn't turn into a chiyuv. And even if you want to say that somehow it does turn into a chiyuv, when would that chiyuv be relevant? Hani mili heicha demutaris. That's only if she could be his wife. But lo heicha d'asur, not when it would be forbidden to him. Hilkach, therefore, he doesn't have to redeem her more than her value, because she's going to be forbidden to him. That was all when thinking about the poskim that said a wife is an exception to the rule. How much more so, according to Rav poskim, who they hold that there is no exception to the rule. So according to them, it's forbidden to pay more than her market value. Even if she theoretically could return to him, this would be the case. And so he concludes by saying, it's no longer his obligation. Now it's Am Yisrael's problem to figure this out. He doesn't say what they're allowed to pay and what they're not allowed to pay, but what did you have over here? You had over here, this very troubling tshuva, this very difficult tshuva, very sad tshuva. What you have over here is this din is invoked, and it's to say, yeah, there's a certain person, we don't know her name, but her name exists. It's a certain individual. We know who it is, and the Rav is saying it's more than the market value, so you don't need to pay. That we have here. However, it's very, very important to recognize that this is not standalone. It comes together with other factors. It comes together with the factor that she is asuralai. It comes together with the factor that she doesn't want to come back. It comes back to the factor that it's impossible to get him back. So it's not like the psak rests on this alone. And that's why I say I still don't feel that we have a case and where a psak din of a Rav was, really we would be paying to redeem. The only reason, and the one and only reason we're not, is because we're overpaying and we have that Mishnah that we don't do it. I have yet to find it. This gets really, really close, but nonetheless, not close enough. Okay. Now we continue and go to the final part of the shir. The final part of the shir, I want to show you that this rule of ein poidin es hashu and yoser michmei dmei mipnei tikkun olam comes up in other places in halacha, as you're going to see, as a side issue, usually in a monetary type of dispute. So I have over here 3 cases that we're going to look at, and with that we're going to conclude today. So case number 1 is in the Shalos HaTshuvos of the Tashbates, Reb Shimon ben Tzemach Duran. He starts out in Spain, and then due to the persecutions of 1391 that swept across Spain, many Jews were killed, many converted in that situation, and many fled. Reb Shimon ben Tzemach fled, and this story of 1391 is the subject of this tshuva. He fled to Algiers. He gets a question from a man by the name of Reb David HaKohen, who was in Tunis, another North African city. Oid sha'alta of you asked, Majorca is an island off of the southeast corner in Spain. And there was this problem of the persecution. And basically there's a man who fled, came to North Africa, but he left his wife over there. He fled in 1391 because of the Shmat. He left all of his belongings there. And then the non-Jews came. They took everything that he owned. Then they forcibly converted her. So he managed to flee. It looks like maybe he never even had to forcibly convert. But his wife, who stayed behind, ended up converting. After a few months, his wife's sitting over there and realizing what's going on. She's like, okay, I need to get out. She rents a ship with 150 of this denomination, of this coin, to leave Spain. And she's going to come to where? To where he is, presumably in Tunis, where the question is originating from. And she comes there. Now, how would she have money? She didn't have this money. So what did she do? How did she get on this ship? It's very expensive, 150 kfulos. What did she do? She went over to the people on the ship and she said, take me for free. You come to the port, my husband is there, and you basically say, this is the amount that you pledge. And if he doesn't give you, then you hold me captive. That was basically what they did. And it worked. And the husband came to the port, and he redeemed his wife, and they were living happily ever after. Except, like I said before, it wasn't happily ever after. Why? Because they got into a fight. Look at it. They went through so much together. Okay, now they got into a fight, and he wants to divorce her. Now that there's a divorce, you need to pay out the ksuba. So I'm going to say there were 2 tainas he had. I'm taking out one. It's not relevant for our discussion today. His second taina was he paid 150 for her boat fare. That should come off her ksuba payment. Why? Who asked you to do this? Who asked you to take this huge debt and to go on the boat, and maybe you should have stayed there longer, or maybe we could have found a cheaper way, or maybe, I don't know, he could have with a whole bunch of maybes. But the bottom line is, that was a big expense, you made me pay, that comes off your ksuba payment. This is what he wanted to say. Tshuva. Answers Reb Shimon ben Tzemach. We know one of the conditions of a ksuba is the man has to redeem his wife. It's not written into our ksubas today, but it used to be written. In the Zman HaMishnah, this clause was written into the Mishnah, into the Ksuba. And whether it's written into the Ksuba or not, it doesn't matter. It's mitnaya Ksuba. The Mishnah says befedish. If you write it or not, it's still an obligation. So redeeming includes this case. Now really, he has to contend with a problem here. Because typically, What does a redemption look like? A redemption looks like that one fine day there's a lady walking down the street or a man and they get captured against their will. They put them in a potato sack and they say, we're not giving you back until you pay us. Right? That's a typical shvuya. Here, that's not what happened. She went over to, she turned herself into a shvuya. So is the husband obligated in that case as well? It's not the same case. So he says, yeah. Even though she was masra atzba b'yad malachim, she gave herself over to the sailors. The reason it's the same thing is because kil kol hashmat chayil daisa. For her living over there in Majorca, she would be living in a place of shmad, and remember they already forced her, so she would end up living as a Christian. So yes, she has to get out of that. So this was a means for her to get away. So yeah, the husband is obligated to pay for it. Okay. But then he says, but the Rif and the Rambam and the Ramban and the Rashba say, you don't pay more than her amount. What does this mean then? The Mishnah says, no, because what I told you before. The Mishnah says, stam. There's a machlokes about whether it applies to the wife or not. The Rif, the Ramban, and the Ramban, Rashba, and Rambam, they're the ones who say that it applies just the same to the wife. V'chein roi l'hoyrus, that should be the right psak. Even though there are some who disagree and say that for a wife, you're obligated, not just permitted, obligated to pay more than the amount, which came up in the last shuvah. Nonetheless, I disagree with that. And so therefore, if this 150 is more than her market value or slave value, then indeed the husband is right and it gets knocked off of the ksuba. So what do you have here? You have this Mishnah being invoked, and in a real case, and halacha l'maisa. But in what type of question? In a financial question. It's a financial question. Whether it gets knocked off of the ksuba or not, he invokes this din positively, embraces the din. We don't pay more than market value. And he embraces that din to say how much is going to be paid on the ksuba. I would, if he were in the room right now, I would like to ask him, what would you do in a case in where the only way to get the guy out of captivity is by overpaying? Would you say the same language you're using here right now? But unfortunately, we can't ask him that question. We don't have his answer to that question. We have something adjacent to that, but we don't have that. This is the first of 3 examples of where this din comes up to settle a financial question. Now, okay, the second example comes from the Radvaz. The Radvaz is another one of the names we saw last week. It's a big mekilim in this area. If you remember the tshuva, he came up in one tshuva with 5 or 6 different justifications for why it's okay to overpay. This reason and another reason, and then before he signed off, he said, I'll throw in another reason. This same Radvaz, as we're going to see right now, he invokes this din to again settle a financial question. So what was the Maisa? And all these cases in one way or another open a window into the understanding what the reality was going on at the time in terms of living in a world in where captivity seems to have been a semi-regular way of life. Okay. Radvaz, Reb David ibn Zimra, writing sometime in the 1500s in Egypt. He was in Cairo during this time. Maisa Hoya, here's the story. There were 6 shvuyim that came in the biyad orol echad. That means a Christian. So a Christian shows up to Egypt, and he has 6 shvuyim. Maybe even he was from Malta. You can look into that. Okay. And he was a shliach for another Christian, for another orol. If you look in some of the prints, they changed it to Aravi. But this is the original print, and this is the correct version. Okay. So he bought, so basically, he's the person who shows up in Egypt is a shliach for the boss. All right. Now with the shliach, the shvuyim make a deal with the oral b'mam and harbe. All right. They say, we're going to come to the Jewish community. This is how much you're going to get. When they came here to Egypt, also Akilis and Adava, the Jewish communities, they got together and they made an Adava. That means 500 Venetian florins. Right? We saw at the exhibit in one of the ksubis, the amount was in Venetian florins. Okay, so you see the Venice, remember, is the financial capital of the world in the 1500s. So it's like the way people would talk about dollars today. Okay. Void bo shvuyim acherim, then there's more shvuyim that come, and they made an adava at Sarcham, and they got them out as well. Now, Vagam Kahal Askandaria, so there's a city in Egypt called Alexandria. Al-Alexandria. But so in Arabic, Cairo is Al-Kahira. But you often drop the Al, right? And just shorten it to Kahira or Cairo. So likewise with Alexandria, even though the Al has nothing to do with the Arabic prefix, it's just Alexandria, but in that same way, it got dropped. And so that's why the city is called Alexandria without the Alax. Okay. And then the Kaf and the Samach switch places. Instead of right? Instead of, okay, you get it. Askandria. Anyway, so the community of Alexandria, they also made a fund together, and they put together, now what happened was that there were 100 krunash type of a coin that was remaining in the Gabai in Alexandria, and his name is Yaakov ibn Tibin. And what happened was, then they sent a message, they sent a message to Egypt, to Cairo, that there's one more captive Eretz HaArelim in this Christian country. Because of Legaba Mitzrayim, so therefore the guy in Cairo writes to the guy in Alexandria who has an extra 100 coins, hold on to those 100 coins, maybe we'll end up using it for this guy, this single guy who's in captivity. But he wasn't released yet. Okay, so Haltkop, there's group number one of captives. We had a dollar amount, how much they were released for. They were released. There's group number two, it says very quickly they were released. And then there's one Shavoi who has yet to be released. And when we were making the collection for the first or the second group, there was 100 coins that were remaining. And we're like, maybe we'll use it for this third guy. Now what happens is that then the boss of the Shvuim HaRishayim came and he's like, that was the deal? You let out my guys for that small amount of, 500 Venetian florins? So he went to the ministers and he went to the Katsi, that's the Kadi, those are the judges of Sharia law. And they said, yeah, you're right, it's taka too little. The Jews have to give more money, so you have to make a pshara. And the idea was 500 more florins on top of what he already took, which the community didn't have, and they had to go borrow money now on interest in order to pay this guy. All right, now the community says, 1 second, there's an extra 100 krunash that we have. And the Gabbai in Alexandria has that money. So let's go send it over here because we need it now, obviously, for these previous guys. So that guy in Alexandria says, no, it's already designated. It's designated for the new guy. It's designated for the new guy. And this gets into another complicated sugya that we're just going to gloss over. And that is, if money is earmarked for a specific person, what are the dinim about moving it? So he was arguing that it's earmarked to that new shovel who was captured. And so therefore it cannot be used for this extra payment for one of the two prior groups. Says the Radvaz, the tshuva hadin imatzibor, the community is right. This Gabbai in Alexandria is wrong. Mikama time, and he gives multiple reasons that are beyond the scope of today's shir. One of the reasons is because you're not allowed to overpay. And this one guy, this single guy, you know what his deal is? 300 prachim, 300 florins. So remember that initial group that came, and it was 6 people. They got them all out originally for 500. Okay, maybe it wasn't enough at the end. Maybe they had to give more, but still it gives you a framework. Here, it was 300 prachim just for this one guy. That's more than double. Kiflei kiflayim. It's double the double of Chdei Damav, and this is a reason for the Radvaz. Remember, the same Radvaz who gave us multiple justification for overpaying, that same Radvaz is now invoking the halacha to say that this is another reason why the money will not go to him, and instead will go to the prior group where, although it was overpaying, but it wasn't so much overpaying, and this is his reasoning. What do you see here? That again, even if you're not going to be keeping this halacha in the strictest sense of the word, it's still good law. It's still going to come up in response. It's still going to come up as shalos teshuvos. It's still going to guide daily life. Now that brings us to the last case where we're going to see something similar. All right, the last case is as follows. This comes from shalos teshuvos Parach Mate Aaron. The rabbi's name is Aaron ben Chaim, and he died in 1697. He lived in Salonika. And he's the Rav. All right, I'll summarize this case. Ruvain and Shimon and Levi, 3 Yidden, they go to some place, he calls it Batan. The reason they run to Batan is because there's a plague in the local city where they're living. And Ruvain and Shimon have gone there many times. Levi is his first time coming there. And Ruvain and Shimon, they have their families are with them, and everything has been nice and dandy, everything has been wonderful whenever they go. But today when they went Levi, there's a big problem. What's the problem? Levi is a child, and the only child of a very, very wealthy Jew. And in fact, such a wealthy Jew that everyone knows about this wealthy Jew. And at night, Ganovim came and they said, where is Levi? Give us Levi. And if you don't tell us where Levi is, we're going to kill all of you. So Levi said, it's me, it's me, it's me, it's me. And they took all of them, they tied them up, and they took them up to one of the hills, and they're holding them hostage. They wait a few days, right? That's the protocol. You're not supposed to send notice right away. They wait a few days, and then they send a notice to Levi's father, who's Yaakov. These are obviously all pseudonyms. They send to Levi's father Yaakov, and they say, you need to give us tes alafim gasim, astronomical amount of money, 15,000 gasim. Tes vav alafim, sorry. Tes vav alafim. 15,000 gasim. Okay, they say, we know Reuven and Shimon, you're poor, but Levi's father is very, very wealthy, and so we're going to get it from him. So they send the shliach. Yaakov, the father, when he gets this information, he's like, oh, what are we going to do? He calls Reuven and Shimon's family together. They have a meeting and they make a deal. The deal is, all right, we're not going to give that astronomical amount of money. What we're going to do is we're going to give a percentage of it. 2,500 is what we're going to send. Now, the way it's going to work is we're going to divide this 50-50, meaning you're one group, Reuven and Shimon, you're one group, and I am the second the group. And so we're going to split this amount as 50-50. All right, well, they sent over that little amount of money. It was enough to get Reuven out, but they said, no, we're not happening. So he sent another sum of money, the wealthy guy on his own, without talking to Reuven and Shimon. He sent more money. They sent out Shimon, but they said, no, we're holding on to Levi until we get the full amount. So when he realized this, he's like, okay, he sends 7.5, which basically is half the total amount that they asked for. When they got half the amount, they sent Levi free. After this happened, Yaakov now sues Reuven and Shimon and Bezin and says, oh, I don't need to pay 7.5. You guys need to chip in over here. Number one, we had a deal that I'm 50 and you guys together are the other 50. So we have that deal. So their response was, no, that deal was only for the first amount. That deal didn't hold true for after. After you did everything on your own. He said, no, that deal should carry through. All right, and even if you don't accept that, he says, the bottom line is you were in captivity, and I paid to get you out. And so therefore, I benefited you. It's the same question that's come up now multiple times. I paid to get you out. You need to pay me back. And they're like, no, that's not true. If anything, we were only captured because of your son. And because we're only captured because of your son, we don't owe anything. They didn't go so far to say, really, we could sue you for all this emotional harm that you caused us. They didn't go that far. But they're like, and they said, it was very clear to us that we were only kidnapped because, why did he take us? Why don't they only hold on to Levi? It's very simple. First, they weren't sure who Levi was, so they figured initially to take all three of us. And secondly, it was better, Levi is young and inexperienced, it was better for them to have with Levi one or two other guys because they want to keep Levi healthy and to keep him secure. And so so we were only there as a prat in holding on to Levi. Then they said another taina. Oy tayanim, kaimalon, poisonous. You're not allowed to overpay. Im kain, therefore call me. Whoever paid more, shaloi midaitam, without asking them. Say da lovdi da. The loss is his. And don't mix us into this. You did an isser, in fact. So we need to pay something that, in other words, what you did is so out of the norm because it's forbidden. And so, no, we're not obligated to pay. So the rabbi, in this case, what was his name? His name was Adam ben Chaim. He is a long shuvah. And he paskins like Reuven and Shimon. He agrees that Reuven and Shimon do not need to pay Yaakov anything. Number one, he accepts the claim. This whole thing happened only because of Levi. And were it not for Levi, Reuven and Shimon would not have been taken captive lechatchila. So he accepts that claim. Number two, he gets into the whole discussion of if Reuven bails out Shimon, does Shimon need to pay back Reuven, which came up before. And he brings the earlier sources, some of which we had, that says, yes, you do need to pay back, but the condition is if you have the money. Here, Reuven and Shimon simply did not have the money. If you don't have the money, then it doesn't turn into this debt that you're going to have to pay. And then he adds the detail and says, although it is true that Maram and Rothenburg said that if someone bails you out, you need to pay him back, but that's a case where you pay the value, you pay the fair value. When it's the fair value, then the person who's saved by someone else has to pay. That's what you need to pay. But in this case, it's more than the amount. And if it's more than the amount, then there's no obligation on the family to overpay. Because you're not allowed to. He quotes the Mishnah, you're not allowed to overpay. And the family gave what they gave. Although, 1 second, even the initial amount that they did is more than the norm. Okay, at least that they were moichel. They agreed to that. But for the part that they didn't agree to, then no, you can't make them pay. Why? Because minadin because minadin, I don't know if he means in practice, but at least conceptually, we would make a macha and say, no, you're not allowed to overpay. So once that's the case, then if someone doesn't opt into that, then you can't turn that into their obligation. Where would we come and have the audacity to say that you're obligated to pay back under those circumstances where theoretically, minadin, we would even make a macha. Now, whether we make the macha or not, is irrelevant. The point is, this becomes an added factor in why, in this case, they did not need to pay back. So what do you see over here? It was used to resolve a financial question. But let's also remember, even in this tshuva, you see, he tells us, yeah, but they're also paying more, and that's fine, and right? So in this story itself also undermines the argument by showing us how the family itself violated it. And that was fine. But nonetheless, the halacha was still good enough for them to say, we're not going to be obligated to pay if without our permission, you went ahead and you crossed the line. Even if we crossed it a little ourselves, on our own, and that's okay somehow. But if you went further and crossed it, because this is so out of what halacha asks of, so therefore it doesn't turn into a financial obligation on our own. But remember, even this is not standalone. That comes together with these other arguments that he had in this tshuva. So if we take both what we did last week and we did this week, what do we see? We have a din. We see that din is invoked. We see it resolves issues in halacha. It comes up. We see how communities tried organizing themselves around the spirit of the din. But largely, at the same time, I think it is fair to say that what we saw today, for the most part, and maybe even in all of it, is really consistent with what we saw last time. That there also was a wide-ranging, wide understanding throughout the generations. And last time we focused only on 2 centuries. Now we broadened it a little before and after. There was an understanding that there are ways of dealing with this, or finding a terim, or getting the person out of captivity. And that brings us to the question of modernity. And now in Eretz Yisrael, what's been going on in recent decades over there. And so presumably in the next class, unless I come up with another way of delaying, presumably in the next class, we will go and address that topic.